Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Startup Genome Global webinar series. For today's topic, we will be covering how we support the rise of global startup ecosystems. And as always, we have two of the exact same dedicated sessions, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. London time and 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. San Francisco time to cover all time zones. For today's webinar, we will be going through how we at Startup Genome support the rise of global startup ecosystems. We'll be delving deep into the key ways how we do this, as well as our global peer learning and membership network. Then today we are very fortunate to have Seow Lim, the Director of Startup Development at Enterprise Singapore, where we'll be hearing from her on point 5, what's the impact, and then go into an open question and answers session. So the purpose of the Startup Genome webinar series is to highlight specific tangible topics for startup ecosystem acceleration, with the goal of producing sustainable ecosystem growth globally. We explain how we at Startup Genome and our partners support acceleration of startup ecosystems. And as always, we want to hear your feedback of what you would like to hear more of, topics, delving deep into particular memberships or issues of the global startup ecosystem. So we've listened to your feedback for this session, and we'll be delving deeper into the more key ways that we at Startup Genome support global startup ecosystems. Previous topics include funding policy to support startups and scale-ups during COVID-19, in which we had Professor Josh Lerner from Harvard Business School, as well as attracting the best talent and international resources, globally positioning your ecosystem. And all of these all of our previous webinars can be watched on our Startup Genome YouTube channel, which is linked there. And everyone from these webinars will be receiving the slides after the event. So you'll have all these links. So future topics on October the 21st, at always at our time, 8 a.m. London and 8 a.m. San Francisco time, we'll be covering the topic of connecting your ecosystem's startups with the global investment ecosystem. And we'll have with us the Next Web executive team there. So there's many more to come, so stay up to date on our webinar page, which is linked here. So for today, as I mentioned, we are very fortunate to have Seow Lim, Director of Startup Development at Enterprise Singapore, with us, as well as our Head of Ecosystem Strategy, Stephan Kuester, in London. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Stephan.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam. Warm welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening here from our London office. Real pleasure to be here with you again. Let me briefly summarize a bit what from our perspective is a reaction to feedback we got over the last number of webinars. We presented a lot of our research, a lot of thought leadership. We had very vibrant debates, and a question came up to us, which was less research focused, but rather how can we be part of the Startup Genome network? What do you actually mean? What are the products or services Startup Genome is providing for all these ecosystems that are part of this network? And we found a very practical question and one that needs answering. That's what we are trying to do in the next 20 minutes or so, to summarize it and then really open up for the debate with Seow and Singapore, which we are obviously looking very excitedly to. So let me really quickly start. Mission, purpose of Genome, we've said it many times. We see a startup ecosystem economy and valuations of about 2.8 trillion. That's our latest calculation for the full year 2019. That is economic value that's being created. It is on par with a G7 economy. So no longer are we looking at startup ecosystems as some nice experiments in cottage industries, but they are a major economic factor. Here in the UK, where I'm sitting, they account for about 10% of national GDP, which is enormous. It has surprised all of us, right? If you're honest about it. But that also comes with a lot of responsibility for what are startup ecosystems, what are startup particularly scale-up companies doing, they have become a major economic factor. And that's first of all a good thing, but as having said, it also comes with a lot of responsibility for economy and societal development. The important point from our perspective is to break up to a degree the huge concentration of ecosystem value creation that we still see in the world. A few years ago, it was about 90% concentrated in Silicon Valley, New York, London, and Singapore. That has favorably changed towards a more democratized, as we call it, distribution of startup ecosystem value creation. But to this day, about 68% of overall value created is still concentrated in the top 10 cities. That's something that can't be right, and something that doesn't provide access for our young generations to highly qualified jobs and the value creation that comes with tech and functioning tech ecosystems. So how do we spread the knowledge? That's very much about building more successful and accelerated development of startup ecosystems. That's very much our purpose in life. And that's what we're obviously trying to support with the products or services that we're going to present to you right now. Brief view on the Startup Genome Network, and this is select members only. We got many more, but we try to summarize it a bit so you can see we are really covering the world. We have invested as partners in the firm into expanding our footprint in Africa as well as Latin America. There's still work underway, but we're really happy to see our work bear constructive fruit. So our footprint compared to last year has increased in these regions. So we very much feel like we are really covering the world now when it comes to the Startup Genome Ecosystem Network. Membership services, how do we, and it's not about services, it is about how do we interact with all these members you've just seen here on the slide. What are our interactions? How are we supporting these ecosystems, their startups, their support organizations, and their ecosystem leaders? And we believe this is best structured in about 5 different categories shown here. And I want to talk you through, starting from branding to COVID-19 impact insights. That's something that's more short-term and hopefully will go away soon again once we are beyond crisis. Our ongoing monitoring called Ecosystem 360 Monitor, 3rd bullet point on the list. 4th, our more comprehensive ecosystem assessments many of you have done with us, and prioritization of ecosystem gaps to show where activity ought to be focused in order to achieve accelerated development. And last but not least, ecosystem strategy and the development of a roadmap, something I'm personally very proud of because it's obviously part of what I personally and my team are doing at Startup Genome day in, day out. Let me jump into ecosystem branding first. Why is branding important? Obviously, when we create communications, when we create branding for an ecosystem, we first of all inspire an entrepreneurial community locally. And we are very much coming from the concept of what we call LC, local connectedness. So the better people work together in an ecosystem, the more vibrant the conversations, the faster the development of startups. The factor actually is nearly 2.1. So a highly connected, locally highly connected community and high quality community accelerates the development of a startup by a factor of 2.1. All other conditions being kept the same. So having an entrepreneurial community communicate is important, and branding is part of that, being proud of the ecosystem and its proposition. Similarly important, creating interest on a national, regional, or global level. Of course, we are competing globally around funding, particularly when it comes to the scale-up segment. Our saying always is there's no gap in late-stage funding if you got quality scale-up companies in your ecosystem. This is a bit of a blunt statement, and it possibly should be a little bit more refined, but from my perspective, it largely holds true. If the quality in the ecosystem is there and you talk about it and people understand what's happening in your environment, international investors, VCs will come and they will consider making investments in their portfolios. So again, creating that interest for them. Similarly for talent, we are competing with talent all around the world. The big hubs are attracting, they have masterminded a way of attracting talent, building on their tech ecosystems, but also building on their proposition as high quality metropolitan clusters. When I sit here in London, I believe about 30% of our startup ecosystem talent population is from abroad, similar to myself. I came in 2005 and stayed. And that tells you big story about how to attract and how to attract the best talent. So again, using branding, ecosystem branding, really good propositions. Why should I come as an entrepreneur? Because there's a great lifestyle, a great metropolitan city. Yes, of course. If I'm smaller, what can I have as a proposition? I'm doing the very best in collaborative robotics in a small part in Denmark. The world needs to know about that, so that investors, but also top talent that are really interested in robotics are really looking at this particular geography and are attracted to it. So that's what we are trying to achieve. Yeah, make it very clear what's happening in the world. Make it particularly clear to investors as well as top talent. We believe it's a long-term game to develop a clear and concise ecosystem brand. It's not something that's being achieved overnight, and it has proven for us, and the statement number 4 here holds all the more true for the smaller ecosystems amongst us, amongst the network. Picking a clear focus, creating a very clear narrative. Can be a subsector, a technology specification, a regional approach, telling a story that's unique and that does not seek to compete with the Silicon Valley, London, and Singapore, or New York. There's no point, but being more clever and being more creative in the narrative. That's all about branding, we believe. That's important. How do we do that? Most of all, the Global Startup Ecosystem Report, GSER, just published in June this year for 2020. And to this very day, it has been the first of its kind publication in 2012 when we started, and still the authoritative report on ecosystem rankings, on their development, being read at enormous volumes all around the world every year. We've seen exponential growth in popularity since its first publication. Today, we are about 10 weeks in, 200,000 plus hits on the website and downloads. This tells us a story where we will be at year end, and these numbers are high. Particularly, they are very high as they're highly qualified. These are investors, these are top talents, these are other ecosystem leaders, people within the community that are reading this report. This is not Joe Bloggs with a general interest on a number of topics. Huge referrals, heads of state, mayors, supranational organizations that are using this report, using the report to quote interesting statements from us, but also, and I think that's the more important point, to look at the data and use them for their own thought leadership, for their own research, bake them into their own strategies. So we are really delighted to see how this data, and particularly the GSER, are being used to inform other studies and thought leadership pieces from supranational organizations and so forth. Important to me, we have organic rankings and features on ecosystems in the report. So it's not you buy a little bit of advertising space and all of a sudden a city emerges on our rankings. That's not true. Everything that's in the main part of the GSER rankings and content is organic content developed by our data science team, and totally neutral from any sponsorship. So it's the objective truth as far as we can, by means of data science and objectivity, deduce it. We add to the GSER what we call ecosystem deep dives, in which individual cities, clusters, regions do showcase their individual strengths. We are seeing the example of Seoul here, ranking number 20 in the world, which is fantastic. It's a real success story, and we believe, personally, I believe there's lots to come. When we look at Seoul, it looks at subsector strength, what's currently important in Seoul. Gaming, life sciences stand out. A section of why you should invest, what are the major facts here. So it's highly abbreviated, highly summarized, but it tries to induce talent and investors to have a closer look at Seoul, and really have a high level understanding. That's the promotional bit. We call it the kind of window to a city, to a cluster, that it's meant to create particular interest, and then you click and get more information. We do quite a lot in order to promote and bring together our members, either physically. That's what we loved doing over the last 10 years. On the left-hand side, you see our founder, JF Gauthier, in Amsterdam at the Next Web. This year, we had to move as many events to hybrid or a fully online model, really. And on the right-hand side, you can see our opening speech. We all were part of it. We loved the format. I called it an opportunity and adversity, because we were able to bring together so many interesting people from all around the world who possibly would not have made the way to Amsterdam or London for the physical conference. Next year, hopefully all going well, we will do both, in order to have this moment of PR, of media, but also physical connectivity or online connectivity. Let's see what it brings. adding to GSER publication events, online or physical. This year, we are adding a whole host of subsector reports in which we again want to showcase the different strengths and profiles of our members for different industrial subsectors, life sciences, AI, blockchain, cybersec, edtech. You can see them here on our list. So over the course of the year, we will have by month or every 2 months, we will have a publication for a particular subsector, and we will be ranking and highlighting the most important players in these different subsectors. So if you are a cluster very strong in AI, you certainly will be featured here and will be ranked and will have visibility. We believe that's quite important. Otherwise, we always get this big jump up in the summer with GSER launch and conference, and then it gets a little bit quieter. This seems more conducive towards having constant brand exposure, ecosystem exposure over the year, and also to create the PR effects we want to generate for our members. So that's going to come, and we are starting with FinTech in early November. COVID-19 impact insights, something we invented on the fly in order to provide our ecosystem members, our network members, with very fast, very quick updates on the impact of COVID on their startup ecosystem and their funding landscape. And providing data is one thing. What we really tried to do was to help our network members have policy debates and to argue, to advocate for additional funding for startups to make sure that our startup ecosystems remain intact and we do not lose too many of our fellow startup founders in these dire times when it comes to funding. What have we done? Methodology and analysis directly from the voice of your startups as members, as cities. So a survey in which we asked what's the impact on your market development, on your revenue, on your funding. In total, 6 key areas and startup factors, which we then used in order to articulate policy requirements. In this context, I can also recommend, highly available on our website, our paper on COVID-19 response and good policy, which really has informed many policy debates around the world. To give you an example, here we are looking at our COVID-19 monitor for New Zealand. You can see revenue, change in revenue since beginning of the crisis. It's representative of the startup economy, the entrepreneurial economy. You can see the impact for New Zealand, but then we also put it into context here, Oceania, to have a peer benchmark in the region, and obviously against our global results in order to see if there are particular differences that could trigger additional policy or whatever else reaction and debate. Unfortunately, here we have to say New Zealand looks better than global average, that's for sure. So that's something reassuring. Good policy has been applied in New Zealand already, but this is typically what you could expect for quite a number of factors that are relevant. Yeah, and having said that, COVID-19 is a short-term product. We will use it now. We will use it into the recession that we are all expecting, but it is certainly not something, hopefully not something that we will see being continued in 21, 22. So really short-term monthly information about what's happening. That's what we are providing. Thirdly, and that's more the ongoing monitoring, ecosystem monitor 360. We call it the numbers you need, monitoring, comparing your startup ecosystems. We always feel that typical country national statistical bureaus do not do justice to ecosystem development. They are working with the wrong data sets, wrongly adjusted data sets for our purpose. They do not inform startup ecosystem leaders properly. So we thought to build a simple, a fast, and a concise product that would provide these essential data that is somewhat comparable to what you would get in international statistics, but optimally adjusted for the purpose of building a startup ecosystem and seeing what's happening in there. It's 4 key factors: performance, funding, talent, and the quality and the functioning of community, which we believe are the key ingredients. To give you an example, under these high-level summary brackets, let's have a look at funding. can see there's a whole host of different metrics, starting from an overall summary, going into early stage funding, late stage funding, the activity of investors, how active are they within the ecosystem, and last but not least, the financial runway that the entrepreneurs and startups and scale-ups do have. That would constitute one of these 4 blocks. It is similarly detailed for performance. Performance is looking at exits. It is similarly detailed for talent. Let's have a brief look here. These are the different factors for talent: access to talent, the quality of developers, the cost of talent in a particular location, and added this year, what is happening in respect to layoffs, because layoffs are a bad thing in one sense, but they also provide an opportunity for other startups to rehire in the market, go out to market and get the talent they need. So these are examples for these 4 factors that we wanted to show you. Quality of community. How do we get to a quick, fast, accurate monitoring product? We are using Crunchbase, PitchBook, and Dealroom for funding and exits. And we combine these data sources with social signals and web scale data, GitHub, Meetup. These are the meetup.com. These are the typical data sources. And you could argue, rightfully so, that these databases are, or most of these databases are available to many clusters and cities in the world on a single basis. All of you will have Dealroom or PitchBook or Crunchbase. What makes Ecosystem Monitor 360 different is our investment into data science. We are able to curate the information, to triangulate these different databases in order to make sure they contain less errors, they are more accurate, they are more complete, and that's maybe the biggest element, to combine funding and exits on the one hand side with social signals, which gives us a much broader perspective. We believe there's value in combining these different elements. We call it metrics that matter, based on lots of experience in data science. That is Startup Genome, undoubtedly. Comprehensive data set. Otherwise, you start combining these data sets on your own, which is incredibly time intensive and quite difficult. Cleanest. I was speaking about the ability to triangulate clean data, make sure they are really comprehensive. Timely. We are delivering 360 Monitor at the moment at a quarterly basis to most of our network members and clients for this product, which seems to be about the right timing. Policymakers do not decide on a weekly or monthly basis. That's not the point. But it is important during a year's cycle to early on pick up on signals that something is not developing in the way you want it to develop or is exceeding your expectations. So it's really informing on an ongoing basis. At the moment, quarterly, which we believe is right, but we are flexible. And delivered as a hugely comprehensive report, as well as Tableau-based data for local analysts to work with the raw data themselves, should you choose to do so. Globally benchmarkable, so similar to what you saw for COVID-19, New Zealand, Oceania, global comparison. You can use 5, 6, 7 peer ecosystems to really compare your data on this quarterly basis to see how you are faring relatively to other ecosystems, either leading ecosystems or direct peers. The choice here is very flexible. Last but not least, we wanted to briefly mention full assessment and strategy development in our service portfolio for our members. What are we trying to explain here? When we see entrepreneurial activity, this is a abbreviation of our ecosystem model, what you see on the slide. Entrepreneurial activity is the key ingredient, but it needs combining with the right resource, with the right regional assets. This might be a subsector strength and a traditional talent pool in an industry. It needs to combine with the quality of community, local connectedness. I was referring to that factor earlier on, and global connectedness, the ability to make international relationships, tap international knowledge, and export and sell in the end to a global or at least a regional market. How do we get there? We believe entrepreneurial activity is a question of culture and motivation. But there is a lot to be done in addition around public policy, good legislation, good regulation, good support from the public's side, but also private policy, private initiatives. These are the levers we can play with in order to optimize the outcomes and really to accelerate development. That's what we are trying to achieve with our ecosystem, larger and more detailed ecosystem assessments, typically one-off projects or projects we do on a 2 or 4 yearly basis. This is nothing that would happen very regularly. It's a very thorough X-ray of an ecosystem with lots of conclusions being drawn. And let me briefly explain how it works. we first of all use an ecosystem lifecycle model in order to determine what's the status quo, where does the ecosystem in question sit, and that also informs peer benchmarking capability. There's no point in looking at a developing young nascent ecosystem, comparing it to London or Singapore. There will always be massive factor gaps, and it's really not, it does not create value. So we use an ecosystem lifecycle model, which seeks to segregate ecosystem clusters into 4 phases, all of which are building on top of each other, from activation, these are the really young ones, to globalization. That would be Düsseldorf as an example, or Montreal, or Melbourne, to attraction and to integration. Integration is the very small club of the Silicon Valley's, London, Singapore's, and New York's. And what is important here, so if you got the status quo for an ecosystem, based on these 10 years of data science, we are able to deduce norm strategies that are best suited to help in a particular phase. What should you be doing in an activation phase ecosystem? Activation phase is all about attracting talent, building culture, early stage funding, organic growth locally. This is not about conquering the world in day one. It's a completely different story. It's certainly not about attracting international talent at scale. So to apply the right strategies at this point, that's what the model allows us to do. And we believe it helps our clients, policymakers, to avoid a lot of waste of taxpayers' money to optimize budgets that are going into startup cluster development by doing the right thing at the right point in time. So international top talent at scale, attraction, that's something we need to do here, globalization, attraction, integration phase. If we are in activation, we should focus on very different things. To get that right saves a lot of money and really focuses action where it is required. That's number 2 in these building blocks. Number 3, we understand relevant success factors. We measure by means of online service and qualitative interviews in every ecosystem that we engage with. About 112 plus different success factors, and then we are able to relate those to norm strategies that sit within the model. So what should you be doing in activation? And we look how important are these factors for a startup, for a scale-up, and we measure the performance of the local ecosystem in regards to these 110, 112 plus metrics. We are able to peer benchmark, take the different factors, and we benchmark them against the right ecosystems that should be your benchmarks in the same group, let's say activation phase, but also against a few that are a step ahead. So globalization would be a good example in order to show where the journey could go to. This leads in the end, this process, to prioritizing opportunities for a number of dimensions, which allows you to have a very clear view. What are the top 3 things in regards to talent, in regards to legislation, regulation, in regards to funding, in regard to community development locally, in regards to building these global connections and global connectivity, GC as we call it, global connectedness. We're always trying to focus on the top 2-3 things that really can make an impact, and to segregate those from activities or initiatives and planning that are less effective. Again, it's the same proposition: focus resource, focus budget, and taxpayer money where it really counts. And then last but not least, in these projects, we typically leave behind and organize jointly with all the stakeholders locally, a development and implementation roadmap. This is all strategy work. You have a fantastic paper in the discussion, but how does that translate into sustained action? And ecosystems are not built overnight, so you need action for 12 months, you need action midterm, 2, 3, 4 years, and long-term perspective, what needs doing in 4 to 5 to 6 years. That's all part of what comes out of the ecosystem development roadmap, which we really try to orchestrate with the local leaders, the local stakeholders, local governments, local municipality leaders, mayors, to orchestrate what needs to be done when, and to really bring effectiveness, bring efficiency into startup initiatives and the rollout of these initiatives at the right point in time. That pretty much summarizes the entire portfolio. You may say this sounds all very ambitious, and you are a relatively small firm. We have 35 people in 4 offices, and that is a very true statement, and we are honest enough and transparent enough to agree. So for all these implementation activities that would come out of our ecosystem development roadmaps, we have thought to partner with the world best organizations in their different bespoke categories, and you can see our most preferred partners here on this list. TNW is the next web as a member of the Financial Times Group for ecosystem branding, for talent attraction, for large-scale events. That's our preferred supplier. We believe they do a fantastic job. Global Entrepreneurship Network and their Gen Accelerates initiative with a vast mentorship network, more than 10,000 mentors that are available all around the world. That is access to mentorship. That is access to scaling programs. Global Business Angels Network, GBAN, and Angel Resource Institute, our two friends when it comes to discussing seed funding issues and creating angel groups, effective angel groups. Tech Connect when it comes to talent development, and very varied initiatives around building talent, educating talent, reintegrating existing workforce into a digital economy. Fantastic work. Please have a look. That is happening here. And last but certainly not least, our friends here in London from Frontier Networks, who are leaders in applied blockchain in many different industry sectors. So hugely important conversations. I missed one, Bella Private Markets, Professor Josh Lerner, one of our friends, who helps us in designing funding policies from grant finance to seed stage, to Series A to late stage, and to optimize the different vehicles and mechanisms for good funding policy, where we strongly build upon the advice of Josh and his company, Bella Private Markets. That's us. I think that was a bit of a tour de force, 32 minutes. And I think I shall be handing back to Adam right now. I'm very much looking forward to a very open discussion now with Singapore as one of our cherished network members.
Thank you very much.
To you.
Thank you very much, Stephan. On the next slide, as I mentioned, today we are incredibly fortunate to have Seow Lim, the Director of Startup Development at Enterprise Singapore, and to hear the incredible success story of Singapore as a globally leading startup ecosystem. So thank you very much again, for joining. And we're looking forward to hearing an introduction about Enterprise Singapore and your work.
Yeah. Thank you,
Stephan.
Adam. Thank you, Stephan. Thanks. Well, let me share my screen as well, so that I can share a couple of slides. Okay. So thank you for the introduction, and I really want to thank Genome for inviting Enterprise Singapore to do a bit of sharing here. Firstly, I think Singapore, being a very, very small country, we are still very far from being a leader as a startup hub. But what we aim to do is to create a conducive environment so that startups can groom and can be nurtured here in Singapore. And what I'll be sharing in the next couple of slides are really some of the areas in which we groom or grow the startup ecosystem in Singapore, and also how do we work with Genome to help to strengthen some of our policies. So a very, very quick introduction about Enterprise Singapore, where I come from. Basically, we are a government agency that falls under the mandate of the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore, together with a couple of the other government agencies in the economic sector. And our role is to look at growing companies that are in Singapore to be stronger by building their capabilities and helping them to access global markets. And of course, the ultimate outcome that we aim to achieve is that they create good jobs for the economy. And we do that through four means. Firstly is through building the capabilities of the enterprises and the industry so that they're resilient and competitive. Singapore being a very small market, I've mentioned earlier, it is important for our enterprises to ensure that they are able to tap on the global opportunities outside and around Singapore. Our aim is also to develop Singapore as a global trading hub as well as a startup hub. And lastly, we also are the National Trust, National Standards Board, where we aim to build trust in Singapore's products and services. So just a very short spiel on what Enterprise Singapore does. Now, just to quickly share now in details of the startup ecosystem developments in Singapore and what are some of the work that we do to grow the startup hub here. A very quick snapshot of the ecosystem by numbers. There are about close to 4,000 tech startups in Singapore. And we have, across all the various enablers, such as the research institutions, the venture capitalists, as well as the angel network groups. I think we have more than 200 of them supporting the startup ecosystem here in Singapore. And many of these enablers or intermediaries, we call them, are actually very, very global. They would have, sort of like as offices established elsewhere, and they built a base in Singapore to reach out to the Southeast Asia global market through Singapore. I want to cover two aspects of the ecosystem policy development that we'd like to share at this platform. First aspect is about growing networks. Stephan mentioned earlier about the need to ensure that as policymaker, the global connectedness of a hub is critical. And in Singapore, we believe that, and we have many ways in which we do this. This is just one dimension. So for example, in Enterprise Singapore, what we do is to establish a program called the Global Innovation Alliance. What we do is across the various innovation hubs around the world, 13 cities at the present moment, we establish partnerships with accelerators and incubators on the ground within these cities, which would then establish a bridge for startups that are based in Singapore to be connected to the city, and vice versa for the startups in those cities that want to build a base in Southeast Asia through Singapore to build their networks here in Singapore through these partners. So to date, we have helped about 500 startups and enterprises to go into these various 13 cities. And we aim to expand this effort to up to 30 cities by 2025. Another area in which we ensure that there's global connectedness is to work with various countries around the world to establish programs such as co-innovation programs that allows for the enterprises within these countries and in Singapore to come together, collaborate to build R&D or build products together. And the policymakers from both countries or the countries that are within this partnership will then come in to support the development of such R&D efforts. Just to give you some examples, I won't go into details, but just to give you some examples of how some companies who have been supported and have benefited greatly from such global connected kind of partnerships. So this is the other dimension that I thought was worth sharing from the perspective of ecosystem branding. Really from our startup ecosystem perspective, Singapore ecosystem is very small. We do need to put in quite a lot of effort to ensure that we create vibrancy within the ecosystem by promoting. So there are two aspects that I will share here. The first aspect is an online dimension, whereby we launch a web portal called the Startup SG Network. If you scan the QR code on the bottom left-hand corner, it will lead you to their website. And essentially, it's like a link in of the startup ecosystem of Singapore. So we've created profiles of all the startups and the intermediaries that are based in Singapore. And for anybody who wants to explore or wants to be connected to the startups that are here, they don't have to physically be here in Singapore. They can get connected online in this manner, and they can easily find them online as well. So that's the aim of this virtual platform. And the other way in which we promote and ensure that there are a lot of activities around the startup ecosystem is through events. And this is just one example, the Singapore Week of Innovation and Tech, where we have various dimensions such as conferences, deal making, have thought leader come and share, of which from the startup lens, the Enterprise Singapore also run this competition called Slingshot, whereby we attract startups from all over the world to take part in a competition that would, the finals will be done in Singapore, and the startups will get to pitch to more than 200 judges that are based actually around the world, but they are have development works in Singapore. And the idea here is to profile international startup in Singapore, or have them recognize that Singapore is actually a very good base for them to start or for them to launch in. So I just have these areas to share from the policy perspective of how we grow the ecosystem. And I thought in line with the topic of today's webinar, I just cover a little bit about how we collaborate with Genome to further our policy development work. As what Stephan mentioned earlier, there are many dimensions to which Genome has provided services for. And in Singapore, I think for us, we see two important parts about the collaboration. Firstly, it gives us a very good insight into the various ecosystem, startup ecosystem in Asia. Not just for the purpose of benchmarking, but really about how we can better understand what's going on in this ecosystem to scope partnerships that could enable the startups within our ecosystems to be to benefit. And what's important when it comes to basically, looking at which partners to work with. For us in Singapore, we look at a few dimensions. For example, whether the methodology is sound, whether there is, structured data sets, or there are sufficient data and localized to understand the importance of the data and what is the implication to the ecosystem. These would be some of the important areas that we look out for when we decide which partner to work with. And definitely the ability for the partner to provide insightful analysis that could help us to further, tweak our policies or to come up with new policies if need be as well. So yeah, so that's the end of my sharing for today. So let me just stop broadcasting and I'll return the mic to Adam and Stephan. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sophie. Yeah, we're very fortunate to really get a deeper understanding of the work that Enterprise Singapore and the Singapore startup ecosystem has done, which has contributed to its incredible success over the years. As Startup Genome and Enterprise Singapore have been collaborating now for many years, we're very much aligned that that data is crucial to developing startup ecosystems. Could you maybe tell us a bit more in terms of how important is it in being able to benchmark and compare your ecosystems, either nationally, regionally, which you mentioned in Asia, but as well as globally as well?
A lot of times, data relating to the startup hubs are not so readily available. Many of us subscribe to databases such as you mentioned earlier, PitchBook, Crunchbase, CB Insights, and these data really focuses only in the area of financing, investments, and I think there is quite a lot of data around that. But really the other dimensions, such as what Stephan mentioned earlier, such as talent, such as ecosystem value, etc. These are data that are not so readily available, requires some level of, analysis work plus, some insights to be drawn out and put together. So these are where we really value a partnership with Genome, whereby some of this data can be shared in terms of better understanding the context to how these ecosystems around Singapore has grown. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times when we look at these reports, it's not so much just to benchmark. It's important for us to also recognize that such data help us to scope partnerships. So for example, if we understand the talent growth or the talent development work going on in Seow, and where there are some of these opportunities for us to collaborate in, these are areas that can benefit out of the collaboration or out of the partnership with Genome, besides just better understanding what's going on with our ecosystem hubs around the world. Yeah.
Actually interesting, so that you mentioned this kind of scanning aspect of using the data. I myself have been working with parts of the German government over the last few months and used our own data for a similar purpose. And Singapore obviously popped up in the analysis as a number of other rather unexpected clusters for this particular question to answer where should we collaborate from a certain sectorial perspective. That's really interesting. It's the same usage, and I can see the use case. It's very strong.
In terms of, I guess, how important is utilizing data to align and convince different ecosystem stakeholders? I mean, there's a plethora of ecosystem stakeholders that I'm guessing you and your team speak to day in, day out, from the public sector to the private sector. How important is it in utilizing data to when convening with different types of stakeholders?
Sorry, Stephan wants to go for it first?
Sorry,
Yeah.
we would love your perspective.
Whoever.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. When it comes to data, I mean, when we speak with, for example, the different agencies that support the different dimension of enterprise development work. So, for example, from a regulatory standpoint, for example, if we're looking at, say, asking a regulatory authority to be able to, for example, look at a certain regulation and be more lenient for the purpose of us test bedding a certain product, creating a sandbox, etc., etc. It definitely helps if, when, let's say, we have data points from that shows us how the other cities or other countries are doing, and that could help us in ensuring that there is a lot of value in opening up a certain segment of the regulation to support development work. So this is just one example to which I can think of that data points are really important when it comes to policy making.
So thanks for bringing this up. I absolutely love this statement, because we have seen in our work, and particularly in younger ecosystems, more nascent ecosystems, you are confronted with a regulatory environment that has been conceived for traditional industries, rightfully so, 20, 30 years ago. Regulation for financial markets, for the healthcare system, were established to protect consumers. That's all good. They are totally misaligned in today's world, in a world where it's not traditional banks, but it's also fintech, it's both. Or in health, it's not only university hospitals, but it is also digital healthcare providers. So really to use this insight of data into, we often find that a particular subsector is underperforming. Although the ingredients should be there, the talent is there, the connectivity is there, it's underperforming. And then it tells you a long story to go into specific parts of regulation and to really dig deep to see what needs changing. And sometimes it's just tweaking of few bits of regulatory environment in order to unleash the entrepreneurial activity. So that's great to hear, because we see it so many times, more often in the less experienced ecosystems. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. And I also need to emphasize that a lot of times data points from the talent perspective is sorely missing. And it really helps to understand from some of these reports and studies in terms of how the other cities, or what the other cities do to attract talent. There is a global competition for talent around the world. It is not just us feeling the tension and the scarcity of talent here in Singapore. So some of these data points are definitely very useful when it comes to us making decisions, for example, manpower policy related decision, and it helps us to better understand how we can, for example, be a little bit more flexible when it comes to attracting global talent in a certain aspects, because we are not doing so well in this area, and therefore we need to do more to attract talent, things like that. So I would say that overall, this sort of data points are definitely important for policy making.
Yeah. I can see that talent again is an aspect many governments are looking at, recognizing the need for global talent, and then it becomes an absolute number. Get us 1,000 people from abroad.
Exactly.
The conversation we would like to have is, let's get 1,000 people from abroad. Let's find the mix between technology and managerial, entrepreneurially skilled talent. People who really can scale up a company, not only software architects, both. What's the right female-male gender mix? What's the right passport ethnicity mix? Because in the end, the broader an ecosystem is in that respect, the many more chances it stands to build global connectedness and to build really proper scaling companies. So the issue, when you really go into it, becomes much more differentiated, as opposed to just looking at the numbers and let's get a few people from abroad. That's not the entire story. Yeah.
That's right.
Good.
I guess continuing exactly on this, as we heard from both you, Stephan, and you, Sohin, is that you're incredibly aligned that becoming more globally connected is crucial to the development of startup ecosystems. I guess as a leading startup ecosystem, maybe Sir Liam, in regards to Singapore, could you tell us a bit about the importance of becoming globally connected, and some kind of high level trends that you may have seen in kind of the growth trajectory of the Singapore startup ecosystem over the years?
Yeah. Global connectedness is the number one area dimension that we look at when it comes to policy making for anything to do with enterprise development within Singapore. And the reason is very obvious, right? Singapore is a very, very small country. There's no way any companies will grow if we just look at the domestic market. So from the get-go, we all recognize that our companies in Singapore, not just startups, must be able to globalize from day one, must be able to tap on the markets around the world as they grow. So that's really important. And therefore, if you look across what I've shared earlier in my slides, were just two very specific dimensions for startups, but they are not the only ones. If you look across, and if I could share some of the enterprise Singapore's efforts, we have a lot of ways in which we ensure and we grow the Singapore enterprises' international connections overseas. In fact, in Enterprise Singapore, we have 70 over offices around the world to help enterprises get connected to the various markets around the world. So global connectedness is definitely a very, very important aspect for us, for instance, Singapore, for survival. So it's a very natural kind of policy that policy decisions that we make when it comes to helping companies get connected overseas. And to us, I think there are always downsides to such policy making, right? When we are very, very global connected, the downside is, we get overly dependent on markets. If let's say there are certain, for example, the crisis in the last few months, right? If there's over dependence on a certain markets, when it comes to, for example, supply chain disruption, your entire, revenue, your entire sustainability get affected. So there are still a lot of learning points for us in terms of being globally connected. For example, now we're looking at how to ensure that we are diverse in the way we grow our connections. It's not always about getting Singapore connected to the same few markets. There are new markets, new areas. Even if it's the same few strong markets, how do we ensure that we build strong and sustainable connections such that in the event of the next crisis, we are still able to sustain. We are still able to, our companies, for example, don't get their supply chain disrupted, for example, things like that. So for us, this sort of considerations are really life and death matters for us, and we do think about it in and out. Yeah.
So I had the pleasure of meeting with delegations from Enterprise Singapore many times here in London, and you had some really fantastic and I believe really unique mechanisms also to attract foreign companies, startup companies, particularly as they're a little bit smaller and they start to scale to Singapore, which were, from my perspective, really unique. I don't know if you want to make a few points around your policy or strategy for attracting the future scale-ups and to make them consider Singapore as their new home.
Yeah. Actually, interestingly, it was a statistical decision that made us want to do that more. Studies have shown, right? I mean, we have seen many studies that have shown that an ecosystem, vibrancy on an ecosystem's, ability to be conducive for growth, right, is when there are international players within. Because the global founders will bring with them the strategic networks, will bring with them the strategic know-how and their experience that can help enrich the founders that are here, that help enrich the ecosystem here. So to us, we recognize that a startup ecosystem, for it to thrive, what's important is there must be ways for us to attract good global founders to Singapore, good global intermediaries like the VCs, like the accelerators to Singapore as well. It's important for us to recognize this so that our startups do recognize also that they have to then look at that. They can't be nationalists and they can't, just look at them as, the Singapore government can only help the Singapore startups. It's not like that in here. It's very important for us to recognize, and statistically it has been shown, right? Many of the unicorns around the world has actually international founders where they grow. And it's actually in Singapore, we're not shy to say that the 7 unicorns that I flashed out in my slides earlier, a good majority of them actually have foreign founders, but what they have done is to grow their base here in Singapore, grow their key decision-making base or activities in Singapore, because there are certain infrastructure, there are certain benefits doing it in Singapore, but they are not Singaporeans, and we definitely recognize that there are a lot of strengths in doing that. So all in all, I think the global connectedness is not, I absolutely agree with you, Stephan, it's not just about helping the local companies go out, it's also about attracting them here, and we have policies and interventions to enable that. So for example, right down to the founders who we think should consider Singapore, we make it easier for them to apply for work passes that can help build their business here in Singapore. If they want to bring their teams here in Singapore, we also make it easy for them to do so. Of course, we do have to balance that with some of the local needs and some of the local manpower policy dimensions. But that's not to say that we shut off completely. We always strike that balance to make sure that from the economic standpoint, our businesses and our ecosystem and our industry still grow. Yeah.
Great to hear. Thank you so much for this perspective, because I really believe it's so hugely important, not only to look at the outbound perspective, but also bringing in this talent, this knowledge, the different perspectives. Yeah. And in the end, also this element of global connectedness into an ecosystem. So if I'm really young, a nascent ecosystem, I would always argue, try to grow organically first, but then very, very quickly shift over and try to attract and really bring this knowledge into your part of the world. And I think our data showed you've done a fabulous job in pursuing the strategy.
I think we have a long way to go too. we started the journey, but I think we still have a long way to go. Yeah. Yes.
And I guess just a last question I have, in relation to how do you see our annual Startup Genome global reports? How are they relevant to you? And how do they fit into just as one part of kind of your global visibility strategy for the ecosystem?
So the part about branding is definitely something that helps us a lot. Yeah, and I say that because in my visits to many of the startup hubs around the world, I have heard of many, government policymakers and even the organizations that look at growing startups citing Genome. I think branding is a very, very important aspect for us, and it helps that when, for example, in Singapore, we have always been ranked the top 20, and it helps that it attracts the kind of attention for us and the kind of effect and the kind of impact that it brings to our ecosystem is something that's quite valuable for us. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for today. Is there anything else before we start to close off that you guys would like to add or finish off with?
Nothing else on my side.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much again, Sophie. We're incredibly fortunate to have you here with us today and to get an insight into the success of the Singapore startup ecosystem and its incredible growth trajectory in the future. And so thank you again, Stephan, as well, Head of Ecosystem Strategy at Startup Genome. And we invite everyone to our next Startup Genome webinar, which is on the October the 21st at our exact time at 8 a.m. London time and 8 a.m. San Francisco time, where the topic will be connecting your ecosystem startups with the global investment ecosystem, where we'll be doing this with the Next Web as part of the Financial Times Group. So thank you very much again, Sophie Lim. We very much appreciate your time, and thank you, Stephan. And please reach out to me for any more information. My contact details are on the screen. And we would like to say again that everyone who registered, who attended, or who wasn't able to attend will receive all the slides for this webinar. So thanks once again, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks so much for participating. Thanks for everybody for listening to us today.
Thank you.